You are listening to The Brycen Show. This is episode 001 of the UFO series. Aurora, Texas, April 17th, 1897. This is an article from Eyewitness History /Wright.htm. On December 17, 1903, Orville Wright piloted the first powered airplane 20 feet above a windswept beach in North Carolina. The flight lasted 12 seconds and covered 120 feet. 3 more flights were made that day, with Orville's brother Wilbur piloting the record flight, lasting 59 seconds over a distance of 852 feet. The brothers began their experimentation in flight in 1896 at their bicycle shop in Dayton, Ohio. They selected the beach at Kitty Hawk as their proving ground because of the constant wind that added lift to their craft. In 1902, they came to the beach with their glider and made more than 700 successful flights. About 6 or 7 years before this genesis of modern-day air travel, a wave of UFO sightings, quote-unquote, went through southwestern United States and slowly made its way eastward. Historian Mike Dash described and summarized the 1896-1897 series of airship sightings, writing, "Not only were the mystery airships bigger, faster, and more robust than anything then produced by the aviators of the world, they seemed to be able to fly enormous distances, and some were equipped with giant wings. The 1896 to 1897 airship wave is probably the best investigated of all historical anomalies. The files of almost 1,500 newspapers from across the United States have been combed for reports, an astonishing feat of research." The general conclusion of investigators was that a considerable number of the simpler sightings were misidentification of planets and stars, and a large number of the more complex the result of hoaxes and practical jokes. A small residuum remains perplexing. The strangeness of these cases is not so much the believability of the specific cases, but the sheer amount of witnesses to it over a continuing path eastward. 16 reports were made about a cigar-shaped object flying over rural skies. The Sacramento Bee and the San Francisco Call reported the first sighting of the flap on November 18, 1896. Witnesses reported a light moving slowly over Sacramento on the evening of November 17th at an estimated 1,000-foot elevation. Some witnesses said they could see a dark shape behind the light. A witness named R.L. Lowry reported that he heard a voice from the craft issuing commands to increase elevation in order to avoid hitting a church steeple. Lowry added, quote, in what was no doubt meant as a wink to the reader, unquote, that he believed the apparent captain to be referring to the tower of a local brewery, as there were no churches nearby. Lowry further described the craft as being powered by 2 men exerting themselves on bicycle pedals. Above the pedaling men seemed to be a passenger compartment which lay under the main body of the dirigible, or the airship. A light was mounted on the front end of the airship. Some witnesses reported the sound of singing as the craft passed overhead. The November 19th, 1896 edition of the Stockton, California Daily Mail featured one of the earliest accounts of an alleged alien aircraft sighting. Colonel H.G. Shaw claimed that while driving his buggy through the countryside near Stockton, he came across what appeared to be a landed spacecraft. Shaw described it as having a metallic surface which was completely featureless apart from a rudder and pointed ends. He estimated a diameter of 25 feet and said the vessel was around 150 feet in total length. 3 slender, 7-foot-tall apparent extraterrestrials were said to approach from the craft while emitting a strange warbling noise. The beings reportedly examined Shaw's buggy and then tried to physically force him to accompany them back to the airship. The aliens were said to give up after realizing they lacked the physical strength to force Shaw onto the ship. They supposedly fled back to their ship, which lifted off the ground and sped out of sight. Shaw believed that the beings were Martians sent to kidnap an Earthling for unknowable but potentially nefarious purposes. This has been seen by some as an early attempt at alien abduction. It is apparently the first published account of explicitly extraterrestrial beings attempting to kidnap humans into their spacecraft. The mystery light reappeared over Sacramento the evening of November 21st. It was also seen over Folsom, San Francisco, and Oakland later that same evening, and was reportedly viewed by hundreds of witnesses. One witness from Arkansas, allegedly a former state senator Harris, was supposedly told by an airship pilot during the tensions leading up to the Spanish-American War that the craft was bound for Cuba to use its Hotchkiss gun to kill Spaniards. In one account from Texas, 3 men reported an encounter with an airship and with 5 peculiarly dressed men who reported that they were descendants from the lost tribes of Israel. They had learned English from the 1553 North Pole expedition led by Hugh Willoughby. February 2, 1897, the Omaha Bee reported an airship sighting over Hastings, Nebraska, the previous day. An article in the Albion Weekly News reported that 2 witnesses saw an airship crash just inches from where they were standing. The airship suddenly disappeared, with a man standing where the vessel had been. The airship pilot showed the men a small device that supposedly enabled him to shrink the airship small enough to store the vessel in his pocket. A rival newspaper, the Wilsonville Review, playfully claimed that its own editor was an additional witness to the incident and that he heard the pilot say, "Weaver et Raff Iberksbus." The phrase he allegedly heard at the airship landing site is, quote, "subscribe for the Review," transliterated backwards. On April 10, 1897, the St. Louis Post-Dispatch published a story reporting that one W.H. Hopkins encountered a grounded airship about 20 feet in length and 8 feet in diameter near the outskirts of Springfield, Missouri. The vehicle was apparently propelled by 3 large propellers and crewed by a beautiful nude woman and a bearded man, also nude. Hopkins attempted with some difficulty to communicate with the crew in order to ascertain their origins. Eventually, they understood what Hopkins was asking of them, and they both pointed to the sky and uttered something that sounded like the word Mars. On April 16, 1897, a story published by the Table Rock Argus claimed that a group of anonymous but reliable witnesses had seen an airship sailing overhead. The craft had many passengers. The witnesses claimed that among these passengers was a woman tied to a chair, a woman attending her, and a man with a pistol guarding their apparent prisoner. Before the witnesses thought to contact the authorities, the airship was already gone. An account by Alexander Hamilton of Leroy, Kansas, supposedly occurred about April 19, 1897, and was published in the Yates Center Farmer's Advocate of April 23rd. Hamilton, his son, and a tenant witnessed an airship hovering over his cattle pen. Upon closer examination, the witnesses realized that a red cable from the airship had lassoed a heifer, but had also become entangled in the pen's fence. After trying unsuccessfully to free the heifer, Hamilton cut loose a portion of the fence, then stood in amazement to see the ship, cow, and all rise slowly and sail off. Some have suggested this was the earliest report of cattle mutilation. In 1982, however, UFO researcher Jerome Clark debunked this story and confirmed via interviews and Hamilton's own affidavit that the story was a successful attempt to win a Liars Club competition to create the most outlandish tall tale. An account from Aurora, Texas, as related in the Dallas Morning News, reported that an airship had smashed into a windmill, later determined to be a sump pump belonging to a Judge Proctor, then crashed. The occupant was dead and mangled, but the story reported that a presumed pilot was clearly, quote, "not an inhabitant of this world," end quote. Strange hieroglyphic figures were seen on the wreckage, which resembled a mixture of aluminum and silver. It must have weighed several tons. In the 20th century, unusual metallic material recovered from the presumed crash site was shown to contain a percentage of aluminum and iron admixed. The story ended by noting that the pilot was given a Christian burial in the town cemetery. In 1973, MUFON investigators discovered the alleged stone marker used in this burial. Their metal detectors indicated a quantity of foreign material might remain buried there. However, they were not permitted to exhume, and when they returned several years later, the headstone and whatever metallic material had lay beneath it was gone. Tonight we're going to primarily focus on the Aurora, Texas sighting. A newspaper article of the event still exists, written by S.E. Hayden, a name we'll hear more and more as we look into this subject, reporter for the Dallas Morning News. Below is the original article, and I'm going to attempt to read this, but it's not real clear. The text isn't real visible. The title, "A Windmill Demolishes It." Aurora, Wise County, Texas, April 17th. About 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which has been sailing through the country. It was traveling due north, and much nearer the earth than ever before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually settling toward the earth. It sailed directly over the public square, and when it reached the north part of town, collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank, and destroying the judge's flower garden. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one on board, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. Mr. T.J. Weems, the United States Signal Service officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that he was a native of the planet Mars. Papers found on his person, evidently the record of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics that cannot be deciphered. The ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction of mode of power. It was built of an unknown metal, resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver, and it must have weighed several tons. The town is full of people today who are viewing the wreck and gathering specimens of the strange metal from the debris. The pilot's funeral will take place at noon tomorrow. S.E. Hayden. And now I'm going to read from The Great Airship Mystery, a UFO of the 1890s by Daniel Cohen. And it's Chapter 7, page 103 to 121. Chapter 8, I think. And also to note, Aurora, Texas is about 50 miles northwest of Dallas. And the author from this webpage, the EzekielSpaceships.com, says he knows a number of people from the Dallas area, and I've asked them about windmills there. And they have all told him that windmills would be useless in that part of Texas because they don't have any significant winds even 5% of the time. Now, I don't know much about windmills, so I'm just going to have to take this as fact for now. Anyways, to continue on from the reading of The Great Airship Mystery, Chapter 8, the Aurora, Texas spaceship crash. Sometime between the hours of midnight and 6 a.m. of June 14th, 1973, a person or persons unknown sneaked into the cemetery in the tiny Texas town of Aurora and stole a tombstone with a crudely carved outline of a UFO on it. The tombstone marked the spot at which a man from Mars was buried after he had been killed when his spaceship crashed into a windmill in Aurora. The crash took place on April 17, 1897, right in the middle of the mysterious airship flap. Not content with merely stealing the tombstone, the robber or robbers then used long, slender, pointed, saw-toothed metal probes to work their way down through the hole left by the stolen marker. In this way, they managed to remove metal fragments that were known to be buried in the grave. According to an investigator on the scene, quote, if they went that far, they knew what they were after, and also must have tried to get specimen remains of the occupant's body, clothing, or something to identify him by, end quote. The whole grave robbery, said the investigator, was handled in a, quote, a thoroughly professional manner. The story of the robbery of the spaceman's grave was reported in detail in the July 4, 1973 issue of the Dallas Times-Herald by aviation writer Bill Case. For months, Case had been running a series of reports on the investigations being conducted into the Aurora crash, as well as carrying out his own investigation. This tale of the robbing of the spaceman's grave marks the bizarre high point of a bizarre controversy which began back in 1897 and has not ended yet. In order to try and untangle the events surrounding this strange and rather complicated case, we must go back to the beginning, to the April 19, 1897 edition of the Dallas Morning News, which contained the following story. About 6 o'clock this morning, the early risers of Aurora were astonished at the sudden appearance of the airship which has been sailing throughout the country. It was traveling due north and much nearer the earth than before. Evidently, some of the machinery was out of order, for it was making a speed of only 10 or 12 miles an hour and gradually sailing towards earth. It sailed over the public square, and when it reached the north part of town, it collided with the tower of Judge Proctor's windmill and went to pieces with a terrific explosion, scattering debris over several acres of ground, wrecking the windmill and water tank and destroying the judge's flower garden. The pilot of the ship is supposed to have been the only one aboard, and while his remains are badly disfigured, enough of the original has been picked up to show that he was not an inhabitant of this world. This is still quoting from that article that I read before. Mr. T.J. Weems, the U.S. Signal Service officer at this place and an authority on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that the pilot was a native of the planet Mars. Papers found on his person, evidently the records of his travels, are written in some unknown hieroglyphics and cannot be deciphered. This ship was too badly wrecked to form any conclusion as to its construction or motive power. It was built of an unknown metal resembling somewhat a mixture of aluminum and silver, and it must have weighed several tons. And again, the town today is full of people who are viewing the wreckage and gathering specimens of strange metal from the debris. The pilot's funeral will take place at noon tomorrow. This article was signed by F.E. Hayden, a stringer or part-time local reporter for the Dallas newspaper. Hayden's principal occupation was that of a cotton buyer. Though the story is an absolutely astonishing one, it cannot have come as a total surprise to the regular readers of the Dallas Morning News. The full intensity of the airship excitement had reached Texas by April. In the days preceding Hayden's Aurora account, the Dallas Morning News carried over a dozen different accounts of airship sightings from the area surrounding Dallas. Aurora is about 45 miles northwest of Dallas. The April 19th edition of the News, the edition that carried the Aurora story, had 4 other airship stories in it. Other Texas papers also carried a variety of airship stories during this period through the News, though the News seems to have been the most active promoter of the mystery. I'll read that again. The News seems to have been the most active promoter of the mystery. The stories generated intense interest in the airship. Several accounts speak of the much-talked-of airship. One story in the News of April 19th begins, quote, "A number of persons in this city whose curiosity in regard to the airship has been aroused to fever heat by the graphic accounts of the mysterious wanderer of the heavens, as published in the Dallas News, sat up most of last night in hopes of seeing it." The Dallas News airship stories covered a wide range of experiences, from simply sighting a cigar-shaped craft in the air to actually meeting and talking with the mysterious inventor and his crew, to wilder tales like the Aurora crash or the tale attributed to one Judge Love of Waxahachie, Texas. According to this account, the judge and a companion were on a fishing expedition at Chambers Creek when they stumbled across a group of 5 peculiarly dressed men, and resting on the bank by them was a queer-looking machine, which from the sketches and description heretofore published in the News we decided must be the airship. The men were taking their ease, stretched out full length on some furs, and they were smoking pipes. It turned out they came from the land beyond the polar seas. They were the descendants of some of the 10 lost tribes of Israel. Because there was no timber in North Pole land, the people there had never been able to build ships or railroad trains, and therefore had developed airships which they used for local travel. Said the leader, "On the first day of January 1897, the Historical Society of North Pole Land decided to send out a number of airships throughout the United States and Europe. 20 airships were ordered built expressly for the purpose with a capacity of 5 men each. On the first day of March 1897, 10 of these ships were started to Europe and 10 to America. By agreement, the 10 airships in the United States will meet in Nashville, Tennessee to attend the Centennial Exposition on June 18th and 19th, and the ships will be on exhibition for those 2 days free of charge." Judge Love ended his interview by apologizing for the meager description he had been able to give of the airship, but said, "You can all go to the Nashville Exposition June 18th and 19th and see for yourselves." Well, of course, no airships from the North Pole appeared at Nashville or anywhere else. The story is clearly a hoax, though the possibility of a, quote, land beyond the pole, quote, was still the subject of some serious speculation in 1897. Another obvious hoax was the dispatch from Farmersville, Texas, which reported how the witnesses heard the airship crew singing "Near My God to Thee" and saw them distributing temperance tracts. Not all of the accounts which appeared in the Texas papers during 1897 were quite as exotic as those quoted so far. C.G. Williams reported that about midnight on April 16th he saw the airship and its inventor near the town of Greenville, Texas. The airship he described as an immense cigar-shaped vessel, with huge wings and a wheel like the side wheel of a steamboat. The airship was resting on the ground with 3 men working around it. The leader of the group, the, quote, mysterious inventor, end quote, himself, told Williams that he had developed the ship over a period of many years in a little town in the interior of New York State. He said he and his 2 assistants had taken the airship on a trial run which had been most satisfactory. Indeed, the test had gone so well that while a short flight was all that had originally been planned, the airship had already been flown more than halfway across the country. Still, continued the anonymous inventor, improvements were needed, and he intended to return home to perfect his ship before making his invention public. Correspondent Williams concluded his article on a highly optimistic note. When my visitor returns and I leave with him for Mexico and South America, I will write the news regularly. It is a grand invention, and I am fully convinced that in a short while we shall discard slow railroad trains and ocean steamers. Williams's prediction was about 60 years premature. Then there are what might be called the ordinary aerial sightings, like the one reported on April 17th in the news and a day later in the Houston Post. It was datelined Sherman, Texas, and was a report of a sighting made by railroader W.S. Hellier. Said the witness, "I was standing on the pavement on the north side of the public square last night about 10 o'clock, when I noticed a dark object begin to pass between the earth and the moon. At first I thought it was a cloud, but I noticed at the same time that it was perfectly shaped. The object was going eastward and not apparently at any great rate of speed. It was elongated oval, perhaps 6 times its diameter and length. After it passed by the moon I saw no more of it." One of the more dramatic descriptions of the airship itself appeared in the news of April 28th. The witness was an unnamed lawyer who was returning home in his buggy after a late visit with a client. A brilliant light from above passed directly over the buggy. The lawyer looked up. Quote, "I beheld about 1,000 feet above me, I judge, a huge black monster from which the light emanated. It was in shape something like a cigar, but underneath there appeared to be a body similar to the body of a ship, which was attached to the object and from which the light originated. The searchlight was presently shut off, and a number of incandescent lights flashed around the lower edge of the body of the vessel, or whatever it was. These lights, too, were soon extinguished, and the vessel disappeared from view, perhaps landing on a nearby hill." The lawyer saw the airship rise from its resting place about an hour earlier, when he was within a mile of the village of Hillsborough. Quote, "It ascended till it looked like a mere dark cloud in the skies, when it started in a northeasterly direction and went at a terrific rate of speed. It must have gone at the rate of 100 miles an hour or more. It was headed, as near as I can judge, toward Dallas." What with all the airship stories, F.V. Hayden's account of the crash at Aurora did not create any particular excitement at the time. There is no indication that any of the newspapers that regularly reported airship sightings covered the, quote, "spaceman's funeral," quote, at Aurora. No follow-up story of any kind ever appeared in the news or anywhere else. None of the specimens of debris from the wreck which the townspeople were supposed to have gathered so enthusiastically ever turned up in any museum or local historical society. Like practically every other airship story, the Aurora case was almost completely forgotten. But this story was simply too good to be condemned permanently to limbo. When revival of interest in the airship phenomena began in the mid-1960s, the Aurora tale was resurrected along with many others. Because it was supposed to have involved a spaceship rather than an airship, Aurora was of special interest to UFO enthusiasts who were more interested in extraterrestrial visitors than in mysterious inventors. The September-October 1966 edition of the British publication Flying Saucer Review contained an article by Donald B. Hanlon entitled Texas Odyssey of 1897. The centerpiece of the article was Hayden's account of the Aurora crash. Hanlon was uncertain about what attitude to adopt toward the strange story. He said he presented it cautiously, and pointed out the similarity of the story to a couple of known hoaxes. Hanlon concluded, "After reading a report such as this, one has the impulse to either burst into gales of laughter or head for Texas with spade and shovel." A few months later, Hanlon again returned to the Aurora story in the pages of Flying Saucer Review. The January-February 1967 edition contains an article called Airships Over Texas. Hanlon co-authored this article with Jacques Vallée, a young French computer scientist and science fiction writer who is rapidly becoming one of the best-known and most influential ufologists in the world, a position he retains to this day. Vallée, incidentally, was one of the first to give extensive publicity to the 1896-97 airship wave in his 1965 book Anatomy of a Phenomenon. Hanlon and Vallée once again reprinted the text of the original Dallas Morning News article, along with quotes from a number of other Texas airship articles that appeared between April 13th and April 28th. In a footnote, they add, "A special investigation of the case is underway. Progress will be reported in the review." The investigation was completed before the January-February edition of FSR Flying Saucer Review went to press, for the results were reported in a letter by Hanlon and Valet. The authors state that because of the, quote, highly unusual nature of the Aurora story, it was brought to the attention of Dr. J. Allen Hynek, the Northwestern University astronomer and longtime scientific consultant to the Air Force's Project Blue Book, which was charged with investigating UFOs. Which we'll get into that later. Valet was completing his Ph.D. at Northwestern in 1967 and had already worked with Dr. Hynek on UFOs. Dr. Hynek contacted an unnamed friend in Texas who made an on-the-spot investigation of the report. Today, Aurora, Texas, is not what anyone could class as a thriving community. It is hardly more than a dot on the map, and fewer than 300 people live there. During the final decades of the 19th century, Aurora looked as if it had a future. It contained over 3,000 inhabitants, was the biggest town in Wise County, and the county seat. Aurora was an important stop on the Chisholm Trail, a main cattle driving route of the Old West. Then a number of disasters struck Aurora. There was a severe outbreak of spotted fever, which reduced the population. The cotton crop failed, which drove off still more people. But most significantly, Aurora was bypassed by the railroad, and like so many other towns which the railroad bypassed, Aurora withered and nearly died. There is one small service station in town owned by a man named Brawley Oates. The station, as it happens, is located on the former site of Judge Proctor's farm, where the 1897 crash was supposed to have occurred. Proctor was the local justice of the peace. Dr. Hynek's Texas friend made his first stop at Oates' service station. Brawley Oates was friendly but not very helpful, for he could neither confirm nor deny the story of the crash. But he did tell the investigator to go and talk to Oscar Lowry, who lived down the road a piece by the schoolhouse, in a town called Newark. Lowry was easily located, and he invited the investigator to sit down on a bale of hay and listen to his tale. Oscar Lowry, who had been 11 years old in 1897, said that he had absolutely no recollection of a crash of any kind. He expressed a strong opinion that the whole thing had been a hoax dreamed up by Hayden, who was trying to make the town a tourist attraction. Hayden lived in Aurora and was distressed to see the town's fortunes declining. Lowry said that the T.J. Weems, the U.S. Signal Service officer and an astronomer mentioned in the original article, was really the town blacksmith and knew nothing about astronomy. Besides, said Lowry, Judge Proctor never had a windmill in the first place. He said that a lot of people had known that story was a hoax because Hayden discussed it with them. Lowry said that he also had already been visited by about 20 others who wanted to talk about the crash. Some of them were reporters from newspapers and magazines, and one had actually offered him money if he would change his story and confirm the crash. It was an offer Oscar Lowry could and did refuse. The investigator also found that the local cemetery in which the spaceman was supposed to have been buried was run by the Masonic Order, which had kept complete and careful records of the burial. I repeat that. The investigator also found that the local cemetery in which the spaceman was supposed to have been buried was run by the Masonic Order. There was no record of the burial of a man from Mars and no unknown grave in which such a burial could possibly have taken place. And if you actually watch the episode of UFO Files and UFO Hunters that investigated the case, they actually did find a grave where an unknown, unmarked grave in a spot where he was supposedly buried at. Yawn. And they did confirm that there was something down there, but they weren't able to confirm the existence of the debris and the body and the unknown materials that they were trying to, mainly because they wouldn't let them exhume the property. At about the same time, Dr. Alfred E. Krauss, director of Kilgore Research Institute at West Texas State University, made 2 visits to Aurora. He also talked to Oscar Lowry and got the same basic story. Dr. Krauss then went over the alleged crash site with a metal detector. All he found were old stove lids, rings used on horse bridles, and some 1932 license plates. No pieces of the unknown metal, which were supposed to have been scattered all over the area, could be located. The Dallas Morning News also began to rediscover its own colorful past relationship with the 1897 Texas airship. A reader sent news columnist Frank X. Tolbear a copy of the original Aurora story. In his January 4th, 1967 column, Tolbert linked this tale to what he called the Great Truthful Scully Hoax. Tolbert said that in 1897, Joseph E. Truthful, quote-unquote, Scully was a Fort Worth railroad man for the Texas and Pacific, who had a reputation for integrity. Scully was also known as the, quote, the honest brakeman. He never stole a boxcar, end quote. Scully and his crew reported that they had seen an airship on the ground in Wood County, Texas, near the town of Hawkins. Tolbert wrote, quote, about 15 years ago, Ray Henderson of Dallas told me that all this was a well-planned hoax started by railroad telegraphers in Iowa, and then railroad men all over the nation joined in the fun. Truthful Scully was picked as chief spokesman because of his reputation for never telling a lie. That reputation suffered after the hoax was exposed, Tolbert noted. Others have referred to the railroad telegraphers' hoax. A Fort Worth newspaper reporter said that in the early 1960s he had heard the confession of an aging telegrapher who claimed that the stories had begun with a telegraph operator in Iowa and had spread to Texas. A UFO investigator named Kevin Randall insisted that he actually had the written confession of the Iowa telegrapher, is there a better way to say that? Telegrapher who took credit for starting the whole airship flat by cooking up a story and sending it out over the wire. Tolbert was not ready absolutely to condemn the Aurora story as a hoax, but he did conclude that it was, quote, probably a non-event, end quote. By the early 70s, probable hoax was the label almost all ufologists pinned on the Aurora story. David Michael Jacobs, a historian whose book, The UFO Controversy in America, is considered the most complete, accurate, and balanced of the pro-UFO histories, contrasted the Hamilton cow-napping tale with the Aurora spaceship crash. The cow-napping tale Jacobs found convincing, while he thought the Aurora story was probably a hoax. One might think that given the enormous weight of evidence and opinion against the truth of this tale, it might have been laid to rest once and for all. But no, the mere hint that a man from outer space could be secretly buried somewhere here on Earth is so compelling that the Aurora story rose again in 1973. While the 1966-1967 discussion of the case had been carried out primarily among those dedicated to the subject of UFOs or to the history and lore of Wise County, Texas, in 1973 the story grabbed national attention. The ufological community has never been unanimous about anything, so while the majority may have dismissed the Aurora story as a hoax, there were still a few who thought that something might turn up. Occasionally they would talk or write about Aurora or pass through the town asking questions. One of these investigators, Hayden Hughes of the International UFO Bureau, attracted the attention of Bill Case, an aviation writer for the Dallas Times-Herald. Case was intrigued by the story and visited Aurora repeatedly to carry out his own investigation. In March of 1973, he began a series of articles on the Aurora crash which were to run for months and become increasingly sensational. Before it was all over, Case's articles had attracted national attention. Case began by repeating the original Hayden story and by interviewing Hughes and some local residents, such as service station owner Brawley Oates. Oates hadn't even been born when the crash was supposed to have taken place. He had been uncommunicative to early investigators, but he now said that he had heard the story of the crash all of his life. Oates said he wasn't sure he believed in UFOs, but thought there might be something to it. He also said that in 1945 he had helped to seal the old well that had been beneath Judge Proctor's windmill, and while working there had found a large number of metal fragments. The pieces were about the size of your fist, he said, but we didn't think and simply junked them. Later we capped the well and drilled a new one. Then we built a brick well house on the site. A chicken coop now sits on the land where the crash was supposed to have taken place. By mid-May 1973, Case found a scientific treasure hunter from Corpus Christi named Frank Kelly, who said that he had uncovered conclusive evidence that a spaceship had collided with Judge Proctor's windmill and had broken apart, scattering debris over a wide area. Kelly produced a batch of metal fragments that he claimed he found in the area. This metal looks so different, I honestly don't know what it is. Moreover, Kelly reported that he was getting unusual readings on his metal detector from a remote gravesite in the Aurora cemetery. He speculated that the spaceman may have been wearing some sort of metal uniform when he crashed and had been buried in it. The metal fragments were sent out for analysis to a variety of different laboratories. Case then began to produce witnesses to the event, old people who said that they remembered seeing the crash or hearing about it from their parents. 96-year-old Mrs. Mary Evans was quoted as saying that she recalled how her parents wouldn't let her go up to the crash site, but they went themselves and later told her about the body of the spaceman. A couple of unnamed witnesses said they could lead investigators directly to the gravesite. They said they had gotten their information from a 90-year-old man who was too frail to travel. Then came the discovery of the spaceman's tombstone, a rough-hewn rock with what some newspaper accounts described as a drawing of a cigar-shaped craft on it. An existing picture shows a flat rock with an irregular triangular area outlined in chalk and a couple of circles near the middle of the triangle. The chalk had been applied to make the carving easier to see. At best, this representation of a spaceship was crude, so crude that it might have just been a crack or an indentation in the rock caused by the scrape of a plow blade. And that is just what many people said it was. Case's stories continued, and with a new revelation in practically every article. He reported that scientists at North Texas State University had found metal from the crash site puzzling or unusual. Other newspapers across the nation had begun to take note of Case's drumbeat of reports. The story was picked up by the wire services, and a few papers sent their own reports to Aurora. Some of the big names in ufology also began to take note of the Aurora developments. The biggest name of them all was Dr. J. Allen Hynek. As consultant for the Air Force on UFOs, Hynek was often denounced as an extreme skeptic and a professional debunker. But Dr. Hynek had undergone a change of heart and mind over the years. By 1973, Hynek was widely regarded as the world's leading pro-UFO spokesman. Back in 1966, he seemed satisfied with the report of his Texas friend, which indicated that the Aurora case was a hoax. By 1973, Dr. Hynek had changed his mind and found the hoax explanation highly improbable. He urged residents of the Aurora area to search their attics and basements for clues to the 1897 mystery. We feel that people of the area may be able to locate, this is a quote, we feel that people of the area may be able to locate information and physical evidence gathered and kept by their fathers and grandfathers. UFO organizations petitioned the Aurora Cemetery Association for permission to exhume what they presumed would be the body of a man from outer space who had been killed in a crash 76 years earlier. In June 1793, Texas columnist Frank X. Tolbert wrote, quote, "When I was in Colorado and New Mexico recently, I heard more talk about Aurora than I did about Watergate, and I understand the yarn. Rivals Watergate for space and European periodicals." Unquote. The whole issue seemed about to come to a head when disaster struck. Case's article, which appeared in the July 4th, 1973 edition of the Dallas Times-Herald, was headlined, "Grave Believed in UFO Pilots at Aurora Entered Robbed." The article went on to explain how the chief investigator on the scene, Earl F. Watts of the Mutual Unidentified Flying Object Network, had discovered that the spaceman's tombstone was missing and had determined that the metal presumably buried with the body was also missing. Watts said, quote, Now there is no metal response from the grave. It has disappeared completely." End quote. Watts also assumed that the robbers had taken anything else of interest that the grave might contain. Watts did not speculate on who he thought had done the grave robbing or why. Case was furious. He insisted that he had been anticipating something of the sort, and that he and others had strongly urged the Aurora Cemetery Association to provide some sort of security for the, quote, spaceman's grave. Quote, "They moved slowly in Wise County, and the sheriff never moved on the injunction. As a result, they lost the stone, and we lost evidence we need," end quote. The Aurora Cemetery Association had a gripe of its own. Since all the excitement had begun, flocks of people had been tramping about the little cemetery, often breaking off bits of tombstones to take home as souvenirs. The association banned all investigation in the cemetery and vowed to fight any exhumation orders in the courts. The association backed up the ban by posting guards at night. The dispute turned bitter. A reaction to all the publicity had already begun to set in. It is impossible to determine what the majority of Aurora residents really thought about the possibility that a spaceman was buried somewhere in their own cemetery. Some said there might be something to the whole business. Quote, I'd like to see what's down there, quote, said Town Marshal H.R. Idell. Others just laughed and said the whole thing was a joke. A few became enraged. 86-year-old Etta Peggs, a writer and local historian told reporters and anyone else who would listen, quote, "It was all a hoax cooked up by Hayden and a bunch of men sitting around in the general store," end quote. Hayden was a well-known joker. Besides, she added, Judge Proctor never even had a windmill on his property. Internecine warfare among ufologists and ufological groups is common and fierce. Often ufologists expend more energy on savaging their rivals than they do on trying to prove their case. And you could probably say that about any field in the paranormal or weird community. A dispute of that type broke out over Aurora. The spaceship crash theory was supported by MUFON and the National Investigations Committee for Aerial Phenomena. So that's MUFON and NICAP. A longtime rival of both of these organizations was the Arizona-based Aerial Phenomena Research Organization, or the APRO. In the past, the APRO had regularly and often uncritically supported all sorts of exotic UFO claims, but when it came to Aurora and the claims of some of their rivals, APRO became super skeptical. The APRO bulletin charged that there was nothing at all strange or unusual about any of the metal found at the Aurora site. Some of the metal turned in for analysis was an ordinary aluminum alloy. APRO went on to point out that if the metal had lain in the ground since 1897, it would have deteriorated somewhat. Yet the metal found at Aurora was in remarkably good shape. Previous investigators had found only stove lids and license plates. The obvious conclusion, said the RPRO bulletin, was that the metal fragments had been brought to the site quite recently and had no connection with what was supposed to have happened in 1897. The article concluded, "It seems certain that we should relegate the story of the 1897 Aurora, Texas airship crash to the hoax bin." In a later issue of the bulletin, APRO charged the investigation had amounted, quote, "mainly to a publicity campaign for a UFO group," unquote. The bulletin also said that investigators for the group had a chemist's report dated June 18th indicating that the metal samples found at the site were quite ordinary, yet, quote, "they were still pumping the story for all it's worth as late as the 10th of July," unquote. The apparent target of these attacks was MUFON, whose national director Walter Andrus had assumed a prominent role in the investigation. Even Hayden Hughes, who had been one of those originally responsible for renewing interest in the Aurora story, had become disillusioned. Of Bill Case's articles, Hughes said, quote, "It appears now that the incident was exploited for publicity," end quote. Hughes disputed the claims made by scientific treasure hunter Frank Kelly about the unusual nature of the metal found at the site, and complained that Kelly had dropped out of sight and was no longer available for questioning. Hughes's organization, the International UFO Bureau, did locate some of the elderly eyewitnesses that Case had quoted, and got quite a different story from them. Mary Evans complained, "They wrote that up to suit themselves. I didn't say it this way," end quote. Carl Stevens, one of the witnesses who had been quoted by Case, insisted he had never said his father had actually seen the airship, and all that he had seen personally in 1897 was a fire. Quote, "I thought it was a house that was burning." Said Hughes, quote, "Mr. G.C. Curley, another witness located by Case, turned out to be named A.J. McCurley, and he was teaching school in Oklahoma at that time," end quote. Reporter Bill Case, who had become the primary focus of the new Aurora controversy, died in December 1974, while a few organizations like MUFON continued to press for the right to dig up what they believed to be the spaceman's gravesite. The Aurora Cemetery Association held firm. People continued to come to Aurora looking for evidence. Quote, "Mostly folks just poke around in the ruins," end quote, said Town Marshal Dell. There were no new revelations. Nothing at all happened or seemed likely to happen. Still, their story of the Aurora airship crash continued to be told and retold to the country. The story reached its pinnacle of journalistic respectability when it was honored by coverage in the New York Times. There is a general feeling that a story isn't really news until it appears in the Times. Aurora became news in February 1979. The following month, it was also the subject of a brief article in Time magazine. The usually reliable Times got a surprising number of details wrong. For example, it had the ship crashing into Judge Proctor's window rather than his windmill. The Times article neither endorsed nor ridiculed the spaceman idea, but concluded that the whole thing was a puzzle and likely to remain so. Since the New York Times is the national paper of record, this article assures the Aurora case a degree of immortality. 50 or 100 years from now, someone poring over old microfilms of the times will run across the article and wonder whether a spaceship really did crash into Judge Proctor's window. What really did happen? The safest way to answer that question is to say that the mystery is, quote, unsolved. But a hard look at all the facts surrounding this case can lead a reasonable person to only one possible conclusion. The airship crash never happened. The whole thing was a hoax. The only evidence that the crash took place at all is Hayden's original Dallas Morning News article. The other eyewitnesses that Case claimed he located were all persons in their 90s trying to recall events over 3/4 of a century past. And at that, some later claimed they had been misquoted. Town records contain nothing about a crash of any kind. There are no contemporary diaries, letters, or anything else that mentions the crash. Though tons of metal debris were supposed to have been scattered about, not a single unusual piece of metal has ever turned up anywhere. The spaceman's records, written in, quote, unknown hieroglyphics, end quote, have disappeared without a trace, if they ever existed in the first place. Would digging up the spaceman's grave end the controversy once and for all? I doubt it. And remember, I'm still reading from that guy's book. Hell, what was it called? Let's see. Oh, The Great Airship Mystery, a UFO of the 1890s by Daniel Cohen. Yeah, I'm still reading from this sucker. I'm taking a lot out of it. But it's a great book. I think it goes into detail that it's actually pretty hard to find anywhere else on this specific case. Alright. Alright, and according to this book, all the revelations and controversy of 1973 are just smoke. There is nothing but Hayden's article, and if the crash really did take place, there would have to be additional evidence. One can speculate endlessly on Hayden's motives for concocting this particular hoax. It does not seem necessary to blame truthful Scully or a cabal of railroad telegraphers for the tale. Telegraphers may have helped to spread the airship excitement throughout the country, but there is no evidence that this particular tale was the creation of anybody but cotton buyer F.E. Hayden, though one Aurora old-timer suggested that Judge Proctor himself might have been the original joker. She recalled her father saying the judge outdid himself that time. Possibly Hayden or Proctor wished to draw attention to the dying town of Aurora, but it would be my guess that Hayden, like Alex Hamilton in Kansas, just wanted to tell a whopper and see if he could get away with it. He did. And that's the end of the reading from the airship book by Daniel Cohen. But it's interesting that other investigators have come up with slightly different conclusions. The investigator Jim Hickman of the Jim Hickman Reports says that he uncovered traces of military involvement around Aurora, Texas, in this article that was posted to Jeff Rentz's website, Rentz.com. Quote, last year we made a field investigation in the small town of Aurora, Texas, just north of Fort Worth. The results of our research are weird, to say the least. One of the first things you might notice when arriving in Aurora is that there are military traces everywhere in town. It even boasts a small military-type airport circa 1940s. Even the streets of town are laid out in typical base fashion. To anyone who has ever served in the military, the signs of military habitations are clear. Why would the military want to have a base in Aurora? I asked myself. Back in the 40s. Let's see. If my memory is correct, I believe that the Roswell crash debris was flown directly to Fort Worth, Texas, which is less than 10 miles as the crow flies from Aurora. Coincidence? I don't think so. Could the military have had an alien recovery base set up and running from clear back 100 years ago? I am beginning to wonder as we continue on our tour of Aurora, the city. End quote from that article. And now, in an article from TexasEscapes.com, aurora-incident-1897-newspaper-accounts.htm, written by James L. Choron, Choron. Quote, another story that circulated in the area at the time but was not recorded in the pages of the press has it that the pilot actually survived the crash, briefly, and that Aurora's town doctor attempted to render aid to the strange being. His anatomy was so vastly different from our own, the story goes, that the ministrations of the local physician were pointless, and the being died within a few hours of the crash, never regaining consciousness. To support this story, which was widely told at the time, persistent rumors have circulated about a diary kept by the doctor, which disappeared in the late 40s or early 50s when a team of United States Air Force officials made an examination of the crash site and collected all remaining evidence, both on the site and from private individuals that could be found. Likewise, there have been numerous reports that the United States Air Force did, in fact, recover some fragments of the mysterious metal that the airship was built of, and took them away for evaluation. Many local residents say to this day that the only thing that prevented these government representatives from exhuming the body of the pilot was the fact that the grave was unmarked, and the exact spot unknown, or at least claimed to be so. And this is also rather interesting that they're talking about this, because this is this time period when the United States Air Force was running around investigating this kind of thing. As I said, the late 40s or early 50s. This is pointing to something that we're probably going to talk about in another episode, and that is the 3 projects done by the government to study the UFO phenomena. You have Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book, and at this point in time that we were talking about and reading from that article is during the period of time Project Sign was going on, and that actually seemed to support the validity of the UFO case, but yeah, that's just a corresponding note right there that the U.S. government was in fact going around collecting evidence of UFOs at that time, publicly admitted. Something interesting to me also is that the supposed Mr. T.J. Weems, the U.S. Army Signal Services officer at this place and the expert on astronomy, gives it as his opinion that the pilot was a native of the planet Mars. This is strange to me. Unfortunately, and I think that the writer with the previous article would agree, that no one has ever really been able to prove who Mr. T.J. Weems was. And I think this is a vital aspect of this case. But something else that is very interesting is this actually happened around the same, a little bit before, well, I wouldn't say a little bit before, but around the time of the release of War of the Worlds. From Wikipedia, The War of the Worlds, 1898, a science fiction novel by Herbert George Wells, is the first-person narrative of an unnamed protagonist's adventures in London and the countryside west of London as Earth is invaded by Martians. Written in 1895 to 1897, the same time period we're talking here, it is one of the earliest stories that details a conflict between mankind and an alien race. The War of the Worlds has two parts. Book 1, The Coming of the Martians, and Book 2, The Earth Under the Martians. So, like I referenced earlier, it's strange that they would say it's an actual Martian, because that was what was kind of becoming popular in popular culture at the time. Now, I don't know if one led to the other or what, but it is interesting that we're still talking about the same race of people coming and visiting us. Anyway, it's continued from Wikipedia. The narrator, a philosophically inclined author, struggles to return to his wife while seeing the Martians lay waste to southern England. And what we call that is invasion literature. And it's basically a point in time, referencing what we've been talking about at this point in time, the late 1800s, when this was getting popular, even though the first book I'm going to talk about following this is in the late 1700s, or mid-1700s. But anyways, some other invasion literature. Voltaire's Micromegas was written in 1752. Includes 2 aliens from Saturn and Sirius, which anyone who knows anything about the mystery schools, stuff like that, knows these are very important uh, astronomical bodies. Includes 2 aliens from Saturn and Sirius who are of immense size and visit the Earth out of curiosity. Initially, they believe the planet is uninhabited due to the difference in scale between them and human beings. When they discover the haughty, Earth-centric views of Earth philosophers, they are very much amused by how important Earth beings think they are compared to actual titans such as themselves. In 1892, Robert Potter, an Australian clergyman, published The Germ Growers in London. It describes a covert invasion by aliens who take on the appearance of human beings and attempt to develop a virulent disease to assist in their plans for global conquest. It was not widely read, and consequently Wells' vastly more successful novel is generally credited as the seminal alien invasion story. And something also that I think is vital in here when we're getting into the time period when UFOs are being seen and the whole idea of extraterrestrials, invading the world, is coming about, is The Cult of Lam by Aleister Crowley. If you don't know anything about Aleister Crowley, you should probably do some research on that. And Kenneth Grant. And in another episode in a different series, I will go way more into this whole thing. And we're going to be reading from something on Wikipedia called the Typhonian Order, which I'll go into later. It's all about the Egyptian devil figure, Typhon. And also, when I go into this, you really need to look up online a picture or something of this Lam character. Quote, L-A-M, Lam. And here we'll read from Wikipedia. The Typhonian Order is among the most well-known Thelemic magical orders, primarily due to the publications of Kenneth Grant. In particular, it has influenced Dragon Rouge and was instrumental in the creation of Nema's Maat magic movement. While the group is still known to promote the Crowleyan law of Thelema, it is said to also focus on exploration of foreign intelligence, such as extraterrestrial life and demons, and on the darker aspects of occult existence, like the Cthulhu mythos of H.P. Lovecraft, which we'll go into that at a later time. For example, Simon Hinton writes in the Typhonian tradition, quote, "Some of you may have heard of the praetor human entity, and in the context of this discussion, this phrase should be recognized as that which is beyond the human. In occult tradition, it is accepted that there are spiritual beings in existence out of the general reaches of human manifestation, and therefore not subject to the same laws of space and time which operate on our dimension. History is replete with accounts of contact between such beings and humans. Examples which spring to mind are Moses receiving the 10 Commandments, the conversion of Saul on the road to Damascus, the seances of Dr. John Dee and Sir Edward Kelly, and Aleister Crowley's contact with Aiwass, Amalantra, and Abudiz. Contact with such higher forces is usually considered to be beneficial, resulting in the communication of new knowledge and understanding." Hinton continues, and here's where we'll get into, the important part. Quote, "There is one particular praetor human intelligence of note which has come to be associated with the Typhonian tradition in recent years, and that is the entity known as Lam. A portrait of Lam was drawn by Aleister Crowley around 1917 in New York. The drawing was given to Kenneth Grant in 1945, and its hypnotic image bears an uncannily strong resemblance to the E.T. representation we see in modern films, although it was painted years before this archetype was stylized. Crowley's depiction of Lam does indeed presage descriptions and representations of extraterrestrial entities which have come to be known as the Greys in UFO literature. It must be emphasized that the Typhonian Order does not appear to interpret its alleged contacts with praetor and human intelligence as an overly literal fashion. Rather, Lam and entities from the Cthulhu mythos are conventions of a sort which enable humans to interact with, quote, something non-human from a human perspective. As Hinton says, categorizations tend to collapse on examination, noting that, quote, nuclear physicists face a similar dilemma on the subatomic level, being unsure of whether quantum material should be defined as a particle or an energy wave. In summary, Hinton states the Typhonian tradition should be seen then as the transforming effect of contact with those forces that lie beyond human awareness. The purpose of this is to transform human consciousness by widening, deepening, and enriching it. The cult has been founded because very strong intimations, well, this is a quote from The Cult of Lam, the Dick Paula of the Way of Silence, Kenneth Grant, writes, the cult has been founded because very strong intimations have been received by Iosik Iowas, which is in Crowleyan history. This is the being that he contacted when he went to Egypt and received the Book of the Law. To the effect that the portrait of Lam, which is given to Grant by Crowley, is the present focus of an extraterrestrial and perhaps transplutonic energy, which the OTO is required to communicate at this critical period, for we have now entered the 80s, mentioned in the Book of the Law. It is our aim to obtain some insight not only into the nature of Lam, but also into the possibilities of using the egg as an astral space capsule for traveling to Lam's domain, or for exploring the tunnels of Set in intracosmic and Chthonian capsules. Organizationally, it is believed that the Typhonian order has shifted from a formal hierarchy to a less hierarchical structure. It is worth quoting Koenig at length to illustrate the organizational distinctions between Grant's order and the OTO. Well, this is basically pointless at this point with this subject. But yeah, I think I'm going to end this podcast here. I think everyone has a pretty good idea about the Aurora, Texas UFO sighting. See you later.